y'all's patience. Let's go ahead. Do this thing. Cool. That. And then do this. All righty. Let's talk about quiz 2, huh? How do people feel about quiz 2? Better than quiz 1 or worse than quiz 1? About the same? Okay. A mix of thumbs. Oh, some down thumbs. Okay. I thought this one was a little bit more straightforward, but you know, I'm not perfect. I'm doing my best. Okay, so let's go through the multiple choice questions. This should be relatively fast. So the first one was just a comparison between for rule systems. We're just asking you to give me the incorrect statement. There's a little bit of a trick there, but I underlined it and bolded it, so hopefully y'all caught this. So our options here were, they require balancing emergence versus over-engineering. This is true, right? We talked about how with fewer rules, you're going to have more general rules that will show more situations, but you need to have a bit more engineering than that, a little bit more adding more rules than that to be able to cover more situations. You have to balance those two things. They are FSMs. Let's get back to that in a second. They don't require writing response to every world state. That's true, right? We specifically talked about how you can have general rules, which are going to be useful in more situations. And they're more general than FSMs. That's also true, right? By general, we mean that they can represent more general behaviors, etc. The only one of these that even makes sense is they are easier to debug than FSMs. The reason for this is pretty straightforward, right? We talked about this. We talked about how for an FSM, we always know what state we were in. We can only be in one state in a single frame, which means we can easily zero in on, hey, I'm going to close the door. Where was the issue, right? What was the state that caused the issue? But for rules, right? We might have tons and tons of rules. It's one rule fired, but we don't know why all the other ones didn't fire. So they're much harder to debug. So it's B. For 2, this is a comparison between FSMs and B trees. I said B trees are faster than FSMs. As one of the options here, that's not true. Because with FSMs, right, we are always in one state or we're transitioning to the related states. For B trees, though, we always have to go from the root to a leaf node to figure out what we're actually doing in that state. So it's a big change. B trees are more intuitive than FSMs. Again, this is exactly the opposite of what I gave you, right? I said that B trees are less intuitive to designers, unless they're already familiar with them, because you have to actually sort of have this understanding of the tree structure, which is less intuitive than FSM. B trees can represent behaviors that FSM cannot. There was a whole slide where I literally said B trees can represent the same behaviors as FSMs, or rather, FSMs can represent the same behaviors as B trees. They just require some extra stuff for that to work. So that can't be it. The only one that makes sense here is D, none of the above. Question 3, what is the below is the clearest indication that we can apply APSP to the game environment? If they are simultaneously, no, we could still potentially apply APSP because they could be completely distinct from each other. Or they could be able to move past each other or through each other. That alone doesn't make the environment dynamic. Oh, wow, lots of, yeah, oh, okay. I guess some people can see the screen share and some people can't. D, I hope you figure that out. Let's try. Again, so right, the whole, which of these would make the environment dynamic? If the graph has edges with negative weights, that doesn't by itself mean that we can't use APSP. Specifically, we couldn't have negative loops, right? Because if we could have a negative loop, then we could continuously go through that loop forever and go infinitely to negative infinity, right? But you could have a single edge on it, or edges with negative weights, and it wouldn't mean you couldn't use it. The environment is generated at runtime. No, right? The environment could generate at runtime and it could still be static, right? It won't change after being generated at runtime. And finally, the player can alter the environment and its graph. The fact that I put and its graph should have been like the big bold letters, like red flashing lights. It's this one, right? This is the one that would make it dynamic. Okay, and then we get into this one. This one is the most tricky one. And of the fourth of the quizzes that I've already marked, this is the one that most people have gotten wrong. Not everybody, some people got it wrong, but or some people got it right, rather. But mostly, if you got one of these wrong, it would be this one. So I give this whole big setup, but most of this is a smoke screen, right? Most of this doesn't matter. What matters is that there's the big map, right? And there's a big map where there's only 3 places that you can change, right? And I talk about how the change works, where we're going to have them go independently. So they could be all closed off, or they could be all open, right? Or we could have a mix of those, which adds up to a total of 8 possible situations. Then I say, okay, which of these specifically would lead to the fastest pathing system for the merchant caravans? Okay, so A star, which would be recalculated anytime the map changed. This can't be the fastest, right? Because already we're talking about this is a large environment, and we know that A star does like a whole bunch of extra work. This ensures that we're going to have optimal paths, but I didn't ask for optimal paths, right? I asked for the fastest pathing approach. APSP is this little thing on extra with it, a unique nav table for each map reconfiguration or configuration. There should be a total of 8. Let's get back to that in a second. Then we had MCTS with a small number of rollouts. This is potentially possible. We'll get back to that in a second. And then we had A star, where we just wait after a path becomes invalid for it to become valid again. This is just nonsense, right? It's just basically A star again, except we're not doing the extra replanning, but it still wouldn't help us any. A star is A star. So it's between these two. So let's talk about this in a little bit more detail. So for APSP, with the unique nav table for each map configurations, that would mean that instead of 1 nav table for the whole map, we would have 8 nav tables. And we would use the current state of the world to basically queue into that. So we're basically doing 2 dictionary lookups every time we want to figure out where we go. That's 2 pieces of computation. For MCTS, even if we have a small number of rollouts, let's say that we only had 2 rollouts, right? We're going to be doing more than 2 pieces of computation because each rollout is going to have a length to it, which is going to be more than 1, right? And then we're going to have to update that iteratively. So on average, in fact, in almost all cases, APSP with unique nav table for each map configuration is going to be the fastest. Does that make sense? Okay, some nods. All right, any questions on the multiple choice questions? There's also chat. Okay, I can see now. O, length of L versus constant time. I mean, they'd both be constant time then, Olivier. But it's actually like O length of L times number of rollouts compared to O of 2, which is really just comparing 2 times L times R. So even if few is small, right, it's not 1, certainly. If I'd said MCTS where it was 1 and 1, where it was a rollout of 1 and a length of 1, that even then, right, even then that wouldn't be fastest, because we'd take a super long time to get where we're going because we could only look 1 step ahead of us at any time. So definitely not the case. All right, anybody else? Questions on this? I feel like the people who aren't here are most willing to ask me questions, which is, I don't know, there's probably something to that. Okay, then we get to Q5. This was basically a reverse of the practice question from last Friday. And basically everybody got this. In almost all cases, at least for the quizzes that I've done already, everybody got this one. That's because there were tons of correct answers here. There was one that was extremely simple, which I'll go ahead and show you. But like, there's tons of correct answers here, right? So let's grab an extra marker. Here we go. So here's the trick. Let me lights. Yeah. Hopefully that helped. I'm not gonna stop the screen share for Zoom because I'm very nervous it's gonna kill my camera again for some reason. I don't know why that happens, but it keeps happening. So we have 5 nodes, right? A, B, C, D, and E. So we know we have to have 5 nodes, right? If we're going to create the environment to match this nav table, because there's 5 nodes. Now from here, we can just use the nav table to really quickly figure out a few things. One thing to figure out is A can only go to B, right? There can only be edge coming out of A, and that has to go to B. Easy, right? No problem. B can go to two different places, right? B can go to D and it can go to C. And it has to be the case that it is generally cheaper to go to D and to go from there to everything else in comparison to going to C first. So I'm going to go ahead and draw this. We have B to C and D, right? Then the C can only go to D. This is nice. You'll notice I'm not putting weights on this yet. We'll get to that. D, on the other hand, has one direct path to A and otherwise can go to E. And generally, it's cheaper to go to E to go to places than it is to go to A first and then to go to A. So it's going to be E, it's going to be A. And then finally, E can go to A or it can go to B, right? And again, it has to generally be cheaper to go to B versus blah, 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 blah. The things I just said, right? So E and B. Check this out. We can have the same weight on every single one of these edges. Ta-da, it's done. You can double check my work if you want, I'll leave that up. But this one was meant to be a little tricky, specifically D, B, and E were the slightly tricky ones. So if you gave particular costs, you might have gotten like B to A incorrect. So if people got something wrong on this question, it was like a single cell, but you lost like, I don't even know, 0.1 points or something like that for it. Like it's marginal. So basically everybody got full points on this one. Any questions? Okay, I know I'm zooming a little bit, but I want to make sure that there's time to get through everything. Okay, so then question 6. This was again one of those like choose your own adventure type of questions, right? You got to first of all design me some rules, just like these rules. Then I asked you to tell me, hey, what rule fires? And then finally I asked you to design some states, right? In descending order. People almost all got this fully correct, but again, you just had to follow instructions. If you lost points on Q6A, designing your own rules, it was because you didn't follow the instructions. Like, so for example, I had people who just gave like all of their rules with like 4 conditions, missing the fact that I specifically asked you for at least one rule with 2 conditions or one rule with 2 conditions. I had people who, not this year, but in prior years where I've had this kind of question, I have had people who will invent their own conditions. Thankfully, that didn't happen this year. Invented characters. They were like, and also there's Mike. Mike is here, which is not correct. Sora is finally here. Anyway, so then from here, this one was fairly straightforward. Again, most people got this completely correct. The trick here, for those of you who are looking to get this as easily as possible, just get your points and move on, none of your rules could fire for any of these, which you could do pretty easily, right, by just designing your rules in such a way. And a number of you did that. But even for those of you who didn't, most of the cases would be not any's throughout all of this. The one situations where you would get it wrong would be if you had a condition that didn't match up. So for example, I might have somebody who had a rule that said, Sally did something when the source was an alien and health was above some amount and the current map was UFO, but the action was like miss or heal or something like that, right? The rule couldn't fire in that case. And I don't know if that's a misunderstanding of thinking like, oh, only some of the conditions need to match, or if that was just a mistake, but you lost some points. Cool? But otherwise, this is pretty straightforward. This one, almost all people got, except in very particular cases. So I've given you examples up here of 5 states. A state had to have a value for every single one of the variables, every single one of these characteristics of who and action and source and heal and current map. Some people just literally listed the conditions for their rules, which wouldn't match, right? Because it would be like with 4 and then 3 with 3 and then 1 with 1 or 2. And so you lost points there because you didn't give me states, you gave me conditions for your rules, right? But otherwise, everybody seemed to get the idea of this. In general, I mean, at least for the fourth, the fourth of the quizzes I marked so far, everybody seemed to have really good understanding what's going on, except for FSMs. We'll get to there. There's a few people who really misunderstood FSMs. Okay, any questions on question 6? Anything in the chat? No. Okay, everybody feels pretty good about that. Okay, question 7. This is another one where I sort of ask you to invent some details. specifically to make MCTS appropriate. And if you wanted MCTS to be for path planning or for decision making. People did lose quite a bit of points on this one. I think it was a common one to lose points on. In general, because people would just like, parrot back when I said to use MCTS. So they just like write large and dynamic and then like move on, or write the equivalent of large and dynamic and move on. But that's not what I asked, right? What I asked was to give me details about the game that would suggest that it was appropriate to apply MCTS. So you couldn't just say large and dynamic. You would have to say, why is it large and dynamic? So be able to say like, okay, these big complex environments, right? There's at least these 3 different maps that we talked about before. Maybe they're all connected. So to say it was dynamic, to say maybe the aliens could change the paths in some way, etc. These are the things that were required for full points. If you wanted to go the decision-making route, you could also do that, but you couldn't just say, make it intelligent, right? You'd have to say, okay, why is the AI need to be intelligent, right? What's the details about it that say that MCTS should be used over an FSM or a B tree? Some people will describe behaviors that like you could accomplish with an FSM or a B tree, no problem, and there would be no point in using MCTS. Okay? I know that's a bit vague. If there's any particular questions about like, hey, what would this work? I'm happy to answer those for question 7. Yeah.
So basically, we can just describe the game and say like, so this is going to be like a tactics game, sort of like XCOM or Fire Emblem, where the enemy can move towards you and you and he's having to move himself, but the enemy has to have like a path planning method in order to find the quickest way to you.
So saying it would need to be like XCOM or a tactics game, that wouldn't be sufficient, because those games don't use MCTS. So in an ideal world, right, I should be able to look at your answer and I should be able to go either because you explicitly said it or you implicitly said something. I can't use one of the other path planning approaches, or I can't use one of the other decision-making approaches and achieve the same effect. That make sense? Yeah. Anybody else? Okay. Okay, anything in the chat? No. Okay, Q8. Okay, so people got the first part of this, no problem, right? I gave you an example right here. People were able to copy that down all right. Everybody used the correct number of variables, variable 1 through 4. That's actually not true. Some people invented their own states for some reason, as opposed to A, B, C, and D, even though I say to use A, B, C, and D. I don't know why that happened. And then they just blank. I don't know why they did that. Maybe they ran out of time. Anyway, but those of you who answered this question completely answered it fine. So don't worry about Q8A. This is the one, Q8B, where people got some misunderstandings. So most of the time, most people got this no problem. The common issue, though, was people assuming you could do multiple transitions in the same frame. So saying that you could go from, let's say, in this situation, let's say that var1 was false. And let's say that var2 was also false. And we were in state A at the end of the last time step. People would give me the answer D. But if var4 wasn't true, there'd be no way to get to D, because we can only do one step, one transition in a single time step. Does that make sense? This was the common misunderstanding that I was seeing. And this is relevant to you, right? Because assignment 3 is FSMs. So you're gonna need to understand, hey, only one of these can go in a single frame. You can't do multiple transitions like that, or else assignment 3 will get a bit messed up. Any questions on that? Okay, all right, we're actually gonna end in plenty of time. And then we have the extra credit. So the extra credit was fun. How do I want to talk about this? Let me erase. Oh, there's like not a eraser. Oh no, there's erasers now. Exciting. Look at that, not falling apart or anything. Okay. There were 2 tricks to this extra credit question. And I do appreciate that a whole bunch of you tried the extra credit question. I do appreciate that. So the first trick, right, is that let's assume that we have your 5 rules from question 6, right? I'm just gonna list them here as 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay, so you can at least put those down, right? Each bark, each rule needs to be a state. That's pretty obvious. I didn't give that to you, but there's a trick here, which is that I said that your FSM should give the same output, the same line of dialogue spoken for the states in Q6B and Q6C. Now in Q6B, almost all of you had a situation where you returned not any, right? Where you said nothing, which means there has to be a not any state as well. Otherwise, in every state of your FSM, every single frame of your FSM, you'd have to be saying one of those 5 things, right? You wouldn't be able to say nothing. Does that make sense? So this is one of the 2 big criteria for this one. You had to include that. It's a little bit of a head scratcher. And then the other one is that every single frame or every single state had to be connected to every single other state. You could either draw this out, which would take some time. I'm not even going to do it. Or you could just write it out. You could just say like, hey, every single state would need to be connected to every single other state here. Like, don't make me draw all those arrows, Matthew. What are you doing? You don't say that last part. And then, of course, the condition on here would need to be whatever were the differences between your conditions between these 2 rules. Right? Does that make sense? Okay. The way that I work this is that you got, half the points here, which is 0.25 for just including a not any node. And you got 0.25 points here for either indicating or literally drawing out that you had to have every state connecting to every other state. And then of course you get the 0.1 as long as you gave me something FSM-y. Some people just gave me a tree. I don't know why. I asked for an FSM and they gave me a tree. And some people just like, wrote nonsense because some people just have fun writing nonsense to me in the extra credits. Okay, that's it. 10 minutes to spare. Dang. Any high level questions on quiz 2? Yeah? Yeah, what's up?
So I'm pretty sure this is where you get like 1 part wrong on 6 days.
Uh-huh.
But if you end up doing, because I just saw the rules here, where
this one?
The must include part.
Yeah.
If you end up having 2 rules with at least 4,
that's fine.
Is that significant for the
no.
3 rules at least 3?
Yeah, so this the only like seriously messed up was not having a rule with 2 conditions, right? So I said 3 rules with at least conditions, which means you could have had 3 or 4 or 5. And you could have, I asked for 1 rule with at least 4 conditions, which could have mean that you had 4 or 5. Cool? Yeah. Anybody else? Hope everybody had a good Thanksgiving. So as a reminder, not this Monday, but the Monday after, you have assignment 3 is due, which means that tomorrow, Thursday, we won't have a lab. Let's fingers crossed, we might actually have an in-person lab. Can you imagine? A week from Thursday. That'll be the helper session for assignment 3. Lots of office hours up until then. Friday's office hours, I'll send an announcement about this, but Friday's office hours, I'm still going to be available, but if nobody's there, I'm going to be sitting in this virtual conference because there's a session I want to see. But yeah, otherwise, I'll go ahead and end a little bit early because a whole bunch of you like to ask me questions afterwards when the whole classroom can't hear you, and that's understandable. So if there's any of those, feel free to come up and ask me after. Otherwise, have a good rest of your day.
Is there a helper video coming up for assignment 3?
Yes.
Okay, good.
That'll be out probably next Monday. So I usually try to do it a week in advance.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Welcome. Hey.
So I had a question about quiz regarding the episode. Maybe I misunderstood the question, but I actually ended up making that say rather than B.
Okay.
But I still felt like I did the question right and I understood it, but I didn't lose my mind.
No, so the way that it works, the way that the quiz, and I'll release the keys, but the ways that it always works is that if you make a mistake in terms of the instructions for like one part, you don't lose points for the other parts. So you would lose points for Q8A, right? Because you just didn't follow the instructions there. Any points for Q8B, which is where the majority of the points for this question.
Okay, that's understandable.
I just want to check the assignment 3 is due October 25th, is next Monday.
I think so. Yeah, I think that's what I just said.
I actually missed the instruction that we had to have a rule with 2 condition. Will that affect my 26B, 26C, and also after?
No, yeah. So just the same question that he had. You only are going to lose points for a mistake once.
Okay.
So you
Yeah.
only lost points on Q6A.
That's sorry.
No worries. And there.